This video, let's get into some dev containers. For starters, what are they? Okay, just a disclaimer, a little familiarity with Docker and containers might be useful, but it's not absolutely necessary. Anyway, so let's get started with what they are. The initial concept is pretty simple. It's basically, instead of you developing all your applications and installing all your dependencies on your main system directly, you can use something like a Docker container as a fully functional development environment. Now, why would you do that? Well, there are certain benefits to using dev containers. Some of them being the separation of concerns. So let's say you're working on multiple projects, and these projects require different tool chains and different versions of software. Let's say project A needs the node 12, while project B needs node 18. Well, you could install both of them using a language-specific versioning system and hoping that everything works out and there are no conflicts. Or you could just separate each of your projects into separate dev containers and have their separate tool chains completely independent of each other, running in the containers themselves and not polluting your system. This also has other advantages like the ease of setup. So how does that help? Let's say you're working on multiple machines and you want the same development environment for the same projects. Well, you can just set up a dev container the way you want it, and you can commit it to Git or copy that dev container configuration into your other systems, and you will have the same system across your machines. Another advantage is the ability to test out newer versions of tools quickly and without disturbing your existing setup. And eventually all of this combine into not having to do any kind of installations and or having conflicting packages on your main system, that is the host system, and you can just have containers for everything. So that's a bit about what they are and why you should use them. Now that we know that, let's get into how you use them. Okay, now that we know the benefits, let's get into how we can actually set our development environments up. Now we have a few things we need before we can get into the meat of it. You need to have Docker installed, which we can do from their website. And the instructions are pretty clear. We'll not get into installations for the different prerequisites in this video. I'm pretty sure there are a bunch of them on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet, and their own documents are pretty clear on how to get things done. We'll need VS Code. And in VS Code, we are going to need a couple of extensions, which I'll be showing along the way. So basically, we can have dev containers as an extension, or we can have remote development, which basically combines a few other extensions along with it. Okay, let's get started. Let's just have Docker running, because without it, we can't really run our containers. And once that's done, while that happens in the background, we will make a new folder and call it dev environment. So this folder is where we will be setting up our container, and I'll show you how to get it a little more project specific. But for now, let's say that this is my environment where I'll create my projects, and my dependencies are contained within this environment. So now let's open this folder in VS Code. Like I mentioned, we need a few extensions. You can see that I already have the dev containers extension, and actually I have the remote development extension, which contains all of these, the remote SSH, WSL, and dev containers. So that's why dev container is pre-installed in my system. And that's basically all you need. VS Code, its extensions, and a running Docker daemon. Let's get rid of this. So this is an example of what you might see when you have Docker running with no containers. Once you have the extensions installed, you can see this green button here, open a remote window, and we click on it. And we have this option here to reopen the folder that we're in a container. So reopen in container, we select that. And here we are provided with a list of dev containers that we have available. Now, I'll be working on a Node project. So I want to create a React front-end project, and I don't want to set everything up on my system. What I'll do is I'll search for Node. And here we can see that there's a bare bones Node dev container that's already available for me. So I'll just click on that. 18 is the default, so I'll use that. This is basically other features that we can have pre-installed in our container, but I'm not going to go through this right now. We'll take a look at this later on. And we'll just click OK and let VS Code do its thing. You can click on show logs to get the logs, like so. And anybody who's familiar with building and running Docker containers might have seen this CLI before. But even if you're not familiar with it, it's not a problem. So once the process has run its course, VS Code is all set up with my dev container, you will see that a folder pops up here called .dev containers. And this folder contains two things, a Docker file and a dev container.json in my case. The dev container.json is basically a configuration file for the dev container, and the Docker file is basically the image that the dev container uses. For now, let's see the container that we have set up and how it works. So let's open a new terminal, and this terminal opens up inside my container. This is not my host system's terminal. How do we know that? So the version of Node that we selected from the dev container setup wizard thing here was Node 18. So I expect that this container will have the version of Node 18. Yep, and that is the case. Now let's check what the version of Node is on my host system. And it's version 16. I can use Node 18 without having it installed on my host system. So I said that I want to develop a React application, and I want my development environment to be set up in a way that allows me to do that. So let's say I use vite to create my React app. npm create vite. Vite is kind of like CRA in that it gives me the boilerplate to create a React app. So you can just leave it at that, and you can get more details about vite on their website. And I'm going to run this. And I'm going to call this my project. Most creative name ever. I'm going to choose React and TypeScript. And we can see that vite ran perfectly fine. And I have my project files here. And I'll just cd into it and run an npm install. Now the thing to note here is all of these files are actually in my host system, but all the dependencies and the tools that I'm using are not installed on my host system. They are being run inside the container. How can I see that? Let's get into my dev environment and see that my project has been created. And all the files that I have are here. And the node modules folder is in my host system, but node 18 is not. So we see that it's installed, and we can just run. Let's see if this project actually works from inside the dev environment. We will run npm run dev. Now for vite projects, here's a little caveat, which I'll show in a moment as I have this running. So the UI for VS Code allows me to just have a button here, which allows me to forward the port that's within the container to my host system. And I can open this in the browser like so. And we have a vite application. But there is a catch here that you might find with other tool chains as well. And each of them will have their own way of resolving it. For vite, the catch is that hot module reloading doesn't really work out of the box when using dev containers. So let's say I want to change this page and add dev containers here. And if I save it, you can see that the model is not reloaded and there are no changes visible here. But that can be solved fairly easily for vite by changing the config file and having server options watch set to use polling and make this true. Once I save this, let's see the dev containers, and now let's see if hot model reloading works. Plus new config. There we go. We have a running vite application in our development environment, and we didn't need to install anything on our host system. So there's no real black magic going on here. It's just a Docker container that's running on our system, and VS Code has connected to it and is allowing us to code using that container. And even our source code is just a volume that's been mounted on the container. And we can see that when we open the Docker dashboard on our Docker desktop app, and we see that this is just like any other Docker container that would run, and our dev environment is just like any other Docker image. And with that, we now understand the benefits of having the Docker file here, because it's basically describing what the container does. And this is basically describing how VS Code works using that container. VS Code website has a good diagram that kind of explains what's going on. Basically what's happening is that it's creating a client server system where the UI part of VS Code is running on our host machine and everything else is running on a container. And even the source code that is just being mounted as a volume inside the container, and all the applications, the debugger and the terminal processes, the CLI tools that we're using are all running inside the container. Okay, now that we're in our project folder that's running in my container, let's say we need to add some CLI tools that we need for our development purposes. And for the demonstration purposes, I'm going to use NeoFetch, which is not really useful for development in any way, but it'll be enough to demonstrate the behavior that I want to. So let's type NeoFetch and check if it exists, and it does not. So we need to install it. So we can treat this dev environment as basically a Linux OS, and we can use sudo apt install NeoFetch and say yes, and it's done within a few seconds. And let's see if we have NeoFetch available here, and we do. So we have NeoFetch ready with us now, and we can use it in our development purposes. But there is a catch, and that catch is if I want to shut this down now. I have done my work and I want to close out of this connection. I wait for it to shut down properly, and then I close VS Code. And let's say for some reason we have removed the containers. So if I have copied this folder across to another machine, I won't have my running containers there. So let's say to simulate that new machine environment, I just have this project folder and I'm opening this up with VS Code. It prompts me to open in a container, and I click the right button and it starts creating my container for me. Let's give it some time to get that done. And there we go. We are in the CLI and we run NeoFetch. And we don't have it. So the tools that we install in the command line while we are in the container are not persistent. So how do we solve this? Well, if it's a CLI tool that's available, it's usually available in the OS. So we can just have this NeoFetch appended to the Docker file, and during the creation of the image, it will have our new fetch tool installed. So let's see if that worked. We'll save the Docker file and we will close out of this container. Close, we will shut this down as well, and we will reopen this folder with VS Code and reopen in container. Now it's trying to build the image from the Docker file, and the Docker file has our new fetch tool as part of its build instructions. Let's see. Now that we're in here in the CLI, let's type new fetch, and we have new fetch because it was installed via the Docker file. Now there's another catch here. So let's check the version of Git if we have any. And we have Git 2.30. So let's go ahead and check what the latest version of Git is. The latest version of Git is 2.39, so we're 9 versions behind. And we want the latest version. So what do? Well, we could try and install it from apt like we did, but let's check the version that's available here. And the latest version of Git that's available is 2.30. So even if we update the system, that's not going to work. So we need some way to install Git in the dev environment. Now that is where the dev container.json comes in. But before we go into that, let's get out of here. Let's create a new project. Let's create a new folder and call it new project. And let's open this up in VS Code. Now here I want to reopen this in a container. So if I reopen this in a container, it showed me. So we will go back to the node.js one. Now, the first time around, we skipped adding any kind of new tools. But now we want Git. And we can see that we have Git from source. Now this is, as the description says, install an up-to-date version of Git, built from source as needed. And this is what we want. We want the latest version. So we click on this, we select OK. Now we can go configure options or keep defaults. I'll check what the options we have. So if a PPA is available, so if you're using an image, let's say of Ubuntu, maybe you can have a PPA from there. So we'll keep it at that and say OK. Now there are two versions of this we can see, and it's always provided and latest, and we will go with the latest version and let the container build itself. So VS Code has run all the tasks that it needs to initialize my container. So let's get into a new terminal and let's check the version of it that we have. And it's 2.39. So what changed? Let's take a look at the dev container.json. So like with new fetch, there was nothing installed here. But here's the thing, there's something called features that dev containers provides. And in these features, you can add, within this features configuration, we can add the stuff that we need for our development environment. Now there are a lot of features available, and you can have a list of features from VS Code itself like we just did, or you can take a look at their website, which is containers.dev. You can go to available features, and here you can search for the features you need. So if you need Anaconda, it's here. You just copy this, you just go to the Anaconda features and see how you need to use it. The README is usually pretty clear about this. So if I need anaconda, I'll just copy this part. Actually, just copy this part from it. And it says we have an option called version, and the default value is latest. And if I need the anaconda feature, I will just paste it here. And if I need any other, and since it said it had a version, just do version, and we could just do latest. There's a lot more that can be done. There's a lot of potential for customization with this dev containers. But that's all for this video. Hope you found that useful. Thanks for watching.